The air in the Hall of Accord tasted like metal and old silence. I had been standing on the speaking floor for 6 minutes before anyone acknowledged me. And in those 6 minutes, I counted 47 sets of alien eyes watching me from the curved gallery above. Some blinked, some did not. Most simply waited, the way something very large and very old waits for something small to stop moving. My name is Alara Voss. I was 34 years old, and I was the last human being who would ever stand in that room as a diplomat. I did not know that yet. Arbiter Sorith occupied the central dais. He was Valkyrie, which meant he was tall, thin in a way that suggested structural reinforcement rather than fragility, and he had the kind of face that had never once in its long life been surprised by anything. He wore the silver collar of the conclave and held a translation rod in one hand, as though it were a scepter. The 47 member species of the Galactic Conclave were arrayed in the gallery behind him, representatives from civilizations that had been navigating the stars while humanity was still figuring out bronze. He did not greet me. He read from a flat panel, and the translator bead in my ear turned his clicking, rising language into flat, careful English. Earth, registered as a Category 3 developing world under Conclave Accord 14, has been reviewed following the incidents at Mira Station, the Dorith Corridor, and the Yev homeworld. The review period lasted 11 of your years. The Conclave has reached a decision. I had known this was coming. My supervisor at the Earth Diplomatic Corps, a man named Paul Griffin, had told me before I left that this session was either going to be a formal apology from the Conclave or a sentencing. He had said it like a joke. He was not joking. I straightened my back and waited. Earth is hereby excised from the Register of Protected Worlds, Sorith said, and the words came through my translator bead in the same tone a doctor uses when they tell you something you cannot unhear. Humanity is reclassified under Conclave taxonomy as an uncontrolled variable. Contact with Earth and all human settlements is prohibited for member species. Trade rights, navigation rights, and communication privileges are suspended. The sole quarantine perimeter will be established within 48 of your hours. Duration is indefinite. I heard the words. I processed them. I stood very still. An uncontrolled variable. That was what they called us. Not dangerous. Not hostile. Just unpredictable in a way that made them uncomfortable. Ambassador Voss, said a voice from the gallery, and I looked up to find the representative of the Hesh, a species that had always seemed genuinely fond of humans, leaning forward with something in his many-jointed face that looked like regret. You may address the conclave. I stepped to the speaking mark on the floor. The room was so vast that my footstep made no sound. I looked up at 47 species, and I thought about Mira Station first, because that was where it started. We had arrived at a medical emergency on a neutral platform to find a Dorith plague spreading through 600 beings of a dozen species. The conclave's response was in transit. Estimated arrival, 19 days. We were already there. We had doctors. We had medicine that was close enough to work. We went in. The plague stopped. 114 lives were saved. The conclave formally protested our unauthorized medical intervention on day 3. Then the Dorith Corridor, where a border war was being allowed to conclude naturally under some old agreement the council had made before my grandmother was born. We delivered food and emergency supplies to a civilian population that was caught between 2 fleets and starving. We did not fire a single weapon. We were still reprimanded for interfering with a managed conflict resolution. Then the Yev homeworld, and that one was harder to explain without raising my voice, so I will only say this. The Yev were one of the Conclave's own member species, and when their northern continent experienced a seismic catastrophe that the Conclave's aid committees were still scheduling responses to, 3 human civilian cargo ships dropped out of warp and started pulling survivors from rubble. We were not authorized. We were not invited. We did not care. That was the one that ended us. I thought about all of this standing on the speaking floor, and then I opened my mouth and I said, I would like to understand which of those actions was the mistake. The room went very quiet. I kept going. I told them that humans did not understand rules that required permission to save a life. I told them that we had read Accord 14 very carefully and that nowhere in its 412 articles did it say that an uncontrolled variable could not reach out a hand when someone was falling. I told them that if the definition of being a problem was helping people without being asked, then humanity was going to keep being a problem for a very long time. Sorith raised the translation rod, and my translator bead went silent. I was still speaking when the sound stopped coming out. I stood there for a moment with my mouth moving and nothing happening, and then I understood, and I closed my mouth. Two Velcari security drones appeared at the edge of the floor. They were polite about it. They always were. I walked between them without being asked, because I still had some dignity left, and as the great doors of the hall began to close behind me, I turned back once. Sorith was watching me, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with something that sat in the space between those two things and felt worse than either. He looked at me the way you look at something you have decided to stop worrying about. The doors closed. I sat in the embassy shuttle for a long time before I told the pilot to take us home. Through the forward viewport, I watched the quarantine buoys deploy one by one along Seoul's perimeter, each one blinking on with a small red light that joined the others until there was a ring of them, bright and patient, sealing us away from everything else in the galaxy. 47 species, centuries of law and order and careful management. And they were afraid of us because we kept helping people who needed it. I pressed my hand flat against the cold viewport glass and watched the last buoy light up, and I thought, all right, you want to see what we do alone? I was about to find out myself. The journey back to Earth took 9 hours. I spent most of it reading the full text of the Conclave Accord, every article, every footnote, every amendment added in the last 300 years. When we broke through the upper atmosphere and I saw the lights of cities spread across the dark continents below, I was already making a list. Paul Griffin met me at the landing pad. He had been monitoring the conclave transmission. He looked like a man who had just had an 11-year joke land very badly. Well, he said, we need a meeting, I said. Tonight. Everyone. He looked at the quarantine buoys visible even from the ground now, red dots in a ring around our sun. What kind of meeting? I picked up my bag and walked past him toward the terminal doors. The kind where we decide what kind of people we want to be for the next 100 years. He caught up to me in a few steps. Alara. They've cut off everything. Trade routes, communications, the medical exchange programs, the navigation charts we were still licensed to use. We're not just quarantined. We're alone, I said. Yes. We've been alone before. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've thought about many times since. He said, last time we were alone, we hadn't met anyone else yet. I pushed open the terminal door. The air outside was cool and smelled like rain. Last time we were alone, I said, we also didn't know what we were capable of. I meant it as something hard and determined. I think, looking back, it was also a warning to myself. Because I genuinely did not know yet. None of us did. But we're going to find out. The first year after the banishment was the one nobody likes to talk about. I understand why. It was not a good year. The quarantine hit trade networks within the first week. 40% of Earth's imported rare materials came from conclave member species. Some were replaceable. Some were not. The orbital manufacturing stations around Mars had been running on Velcari licensed reactor cores for 6 years, and when those licenses were remotely deactivated by conclave order, 3 stations lost primary power in a single afternoon. 2 recovered within a week. The third, Relay Station Kestrel, did not. 11 people died. The official record says 14, but one of the 3 disputed cases was a man named Owen Birch who had been telling anyone who would listen for years that the station's backup coupling system was a fire risk, and he was right, and he died in the fire, and I think about that particular injustice more than I probably should. The governments did what governments do under pressure. They argued. They formed emergency committees. They issued statements and held votes and drafted plans that were revised and then revised again. For approximately 4 months, the diplomatic and political leadership of Earth behaved in ways that were completely understandable and almost entirely useless. What actually kept things running was not the governments. It was the engineers. There was a woman in Brisbane named Caroline Webb who had spent 15 years studying Velcari reactor core design under a research exchange program. When the cores went dark, she gathered 11 other people around a table in a workshop that smelled like solder and coffee, and she said, with complete calm, that she knew how the cores worked from the outside, and she was fairly certain she knew how they worked on the inside, and they were going to find out together. 60 days later, they had a working prototype. It was loud, it ran 20% less efficiently than the original, and it caught fire twice during testing, but it worked. Within 8 months, that design had been adapted and installed in the 2 remaining orbital stations and 14 ground facilities. I heard about Caroline Webb through a contact in the science directorate. I went to meet her. She was a small woman with short gray hair and the particular kind of tired that comes from doing very important work with not enough sleep. When I asked her how she had known they could do it, she looked at me like the question was a little strange. I didn't know, she said. But we needed it to work, so we worked until it did. That was the year in miniature. Nobody knew. Everyone worked. I had no official position anymore. The Earth Diplomatic Corps still existed on paper, but there was no one to send diplomats to. I became, by default and without any formal appointment, the person who connected problems to people who could solve them. I had contact lists from 11 years of interstellar work. I knew which scientists had been studying which alien technologies. I knew which pilots had experience with uncharted navigation. I knew where the gaps were because I had spent a decade watching what the conclave provided us and quietly noting what would happen if they stopped. They stopped. I started making calls. In the second year, a man named Gregory Cole at the University of Edinburgh published a paper arguing that humanity's best hope for long-term survival was not rebuilding what the conclave had taken away, but moving in a different direction entirely. He was a theoretical physicist who had been working on faster-than-light mechanics under a conclave academic license that was now revoked, which meant he lost his data access but kept his mind, and his mind was remarkable. His paper argued that the conclave's FTL technology, which they had licensed to us in a deliberately limited form, was actually a single approach to a problem that had multiple solutions. We had been using their door. We could build our own door. The paper was downloaded 4 million times in the first week. Cole was not a charismatic man. He was nervous in public, spoke too fast, and had a habit of stopping mid-sentence to correct himself. When I brought him in front of a joint session of the Earth Science Directorate to make his case for funding, he dropped his notes, apologized twice, and then spent 45 minutes explaining quantum geometry in language so clear and precise that I watched seasoned bureaucrats lean forward in their chairs. He got his funding, every cent he asked for, and several cents he hadn't thought to ask for. The third year was the hardest. The food supply chains had been partially stabilized. The energy situation was improving, but 3 of the smaller off-world settlements had been abandoned when they couldn't sustain themselves without conclave supply routes. The people came home. The settlements went dark. I attended 2 funerals that year for people who had not died in accidents, but in the slower collapse of systems that simply ran out of the things they needed. I have never spoken about those funerals to anyone. Some weights you carry without putting them down. But in the 4th year, something happened that I did not expect, and it changed everything in a direction I had not predicted. People got angry. Not afraid. Not desperate. Angry. There is a difference, and it matters. Fear makes people small. Anger, the right kind of anger, the kind that is clean and directed and does not blind you, makes people very, very focused. A pilot named Derek Hale became something of a symbol of that year, though he would have hated that description. He had been flying cargo runs between Earth and the asteroid belt for a decade, always through conclave-approved transit corridors, always with conclave-licensed navigation charts. When the charts were deactivated, he did what anyone who knows something well enough might do. He flew from memory and from instinct and from the kind of familiarity that comes from doing the same routes for 10 years until they live in your hands. He mapped 3 full transit corridors in a second-hand ship with jury-rigged instruments, filed the charts with the Earth Navigation Authority, and then went back and mapped 6 more. When a journalist asked him why, he said, "Because they're ours now." Within 18 months, every major transit corridor in the Sol system had been remapped by human pilots. We didn't need the conclave's charts anymore. We had better ones. Our own pilots knew these routes the way you know a road you have driven in the dark. In year 5, Gregory Cole's team achieved something that none of us had quite believed would happen so soon: a successful faster-than-light test run. The ship was called the Meridian, and it was, by every aesthetic standard, ugly. It was angular in ways that suggested the designers had been more concerned with function than form, which they absolutely had been, and it had a tendency to vibrate at a frequency that one crew member described as like being inside a very large, very annoyed bee. But it crossed 1 light-year in 11 hours, which was slower than Conclave FTL, but was ours entirely and completely ours. And when it came back and Derek Hale, who had inevitably volunteered to pilot it, brought it in a dock, the footage of him climbing out of the hatch and grinning like a man who had just gotten away with something was watched by approximately 4 billion people inside the same hour. I watched it in a conference room with 12 other people who had been working on the program in various capacities. Nobody said anything for a moment. And then the woman sitting next to me, a propulsion engineer named Sandra Okafor, who had been living on coffee and stubbornness for the better part of 3 years, put her face in her hands and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, and was actually both. I understood completely. We were not done being in trouble. The quarantine was still active. Resources were still stretched. There were still nights when I looked at the figures and felt the edge of something very dark at the corner of my thinking. But we had punched through the wall they built around us. We had done it ourselves with things we grew and built and figured out in workshops and labs, and ugly little ships that vibrated like annoyed bees. Year 6 brought something entirely new, a direction. The Conclave had registered every inhabited and habitable world within their sphere of influence. The key word there is within. The maps we had obtained, legally, during the years before the banishment, as part of academic exchange programs, showed the outer limits of Conclave-charted space. Beyond those limits was not empty. It was simply unmapped, unclaimed, unregistered. I pulled those old maps up on a screen in my office, and I looked at the boundary line for a long time. Then I called Derek Hale. He answered on the second ring, and I said, "How would you feel about going somewhere nobody has been before?" He was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "When do we leave?" It took 8 months to prepare. 3 ships, crew of 42, enough supplies for a 2-year expedition, and a set of instruments designed specifically to evaluate atmospheric compatibility and resource potential for human settlement. Sandra Okafor redesigned the FTL drive to run quieter. It still vibrated, but at a frequency she insisted was now merely mildly inconvenient rather than genuinely upsetting. The 3 ships crossed the Conclave boundary in year 7 of the banishment. No fanfare, no announcement. We simply went. What we found on the far side of that invisible line was not empty space. It was not a void. It was a galaxy that had never been given rules about who belonged in it, and we moved into it the way water moves into a space it has never reached before. Carefully at first, and then with increasing certainty, and then because it was simply what we did now. In year 8, we found the first planet. The atmosphere was thin and cold and not immediately breathable, but the geology was stable and the water ice deposits were enormous and the gravity was close enough to Earth's standard that nobody's knees hurt when they walked around. A geologist named Fiona Park stood on the surface in a pressure suit and took a core sample and looked at the results and said, with tremendous professionalism, "This is a very good rock." We named it New Meridian after the ship that first proved we could get this far. By year 10, 4,000 people lived there. We were not going back inside the box. In year 11, the Conclave noticed we were gone. I mean that in the practical sense. The quarantine perimeter had sensors, and the sensors had, for years, been tracking our ships moving within Seoul and its immediate neighborhood. When several of those ships began appearing at the edge of sensor range and then disappearing into null readings, because our FTL signature was different enough from Conclave standard drives that their systems filed it as interference. Someone in the Conclave's monitoring division put the reports together and sent an alert. I found out because a contact I had maintained very carefully at the Hesh diplomatic station. The Hesh being, you will remember, the species that had looked at me with regret the day I was expelled, sent me a message through a channel that was technically still open because nobody had thought to close it. The message was 3 words. They are asking. I sent back 2 words. Let them. By year 12, we had 4 settled worlds beyond the Conclave boundary and a 5th under active preparation. The Meridian drive had been improved twice, and the 3rd version was fast enough that Derek Hale, who now commanded the exploration fleet with a crew that worshipped him in the way crews worship commanders who were both brilliant and genuinely happy to hear bad news early, could reach the farthest of our new settlements in under 3 days. But it was in year 12 that we stopped being alone. We found the Ashini almost by accident. One of our survey ships, a small two-crew vessel called the Perseverance, was mapping a star system 300 light-years outside conclave space when the navigator, a young man named Leon Price, picked up an electromagnetic signal on a frequency that did not match any natural phenomenon. He reported it. We sent a team. The Ashini lived on a world that was, by every measure, rich, warm, wet, biologically diverse, with a population of about 600 million distributed across 3 large continents. They were at a technological level roughly equivalent to Earth in the mid-20th century. Radio communications, early aviation, no space travel yet. They were, in conclave terms, a Category 2 developing world, which meant that under conclave law, they were under the protection of a registered member species called the Vreth. The Vreth did not live among the Ashini. They did not help the Ashini. What they did, very efficiently, was control every trade route within 50 light-years of the Ashini homeworld and set the terms by which any ship, including Ashini ships, once they developed space travel, could move through that region. The Vreth had, in other words, staked a claim on an entire civilization's future without doing a single thing for that civilization in the present. I spent 3 days reading everything we had on the Ashini before I went to the team that had found them. The lead contact specialist was a woman named Priya Ashford, who had a gift for language acquisition that bordered on unsettling. She had begun developing a working vocabulary of the Ashini primary language within 2 weeks of first audio recordings, which was fast enough that several of her colleagues asked if she was doing something she shouldn't be. She was not. She was simply paying very close attention. "They know we're here," she told me on day 4. "They've been watching our ship with ground-based instruments. Their radio broadcasts have mentioned us 17 times in the last 2 days. Mostly questions." "What kind of questions?" She looked at her notes. "Where did you come from? Who sent you? And why does your ship look like that?" I smiled. "What do they think of the ship?" Their most popular broadcast this morning described it as looking like a metal bird that lost an argument with something larger. They seem to find it charming. We made formal contact on day 7. Priya handled the first transmission. She spoke to them in a rough version of their own language, carefully, and the response from the ground was a silence that lasted almost 30 seconds and then erupted into what the audio analysis described as simultaneous multi-source vocalization. Later, we learned that this was because the transmission was received at a public radio station, and the staff had all started talking at the same time. We did not tell the Ashini about the Vreth immediately. We spent 6 months building a relationship first, sharing knowledge, answering questions, accepting questions in return. They were curious about us in the specific, thorough way that characterizes a species that has been looking at the stars for a long time and wondering very hard. They asked about our biology, our history, our failures as well as our achievements. When we told them about the banishment, there was a long pause in the response from the surface, and then a senior Ashini scholar sent a message that Priya translated as, "So you know what it means to be told you are a problem when you were only trying to be a neighbor." That was the moment I knew we would be friends. When we told them about the Vreth, the response was more complicated. The Ashini had never heard of them. They did not know that they were protected. They did not know that their future navigation rights were already spoken for. The concept, when Priya explained it carefully, produced a response in the Ashini Governing Council that I can only describe as a very quiet, very sustained fury. We did not have to suggest anything. The Ashini asked us directly, "Are you planning to stay in this region?" I was on the communication when that question came in. I looked at Priya, and she looked at me, and I said, into the open channel, "We are planning to stay wherever we are welcome." The Ashini Governing Council met for 2 days. Then they sent an answer. "You are welcome. Year 13 brought us the Drevithi, and that was a different kind of meeting entirely. The Drevithi were not a pre-warp civilization. They were a fully spacefaring species with their own FTL technology, a strong military tradition, and a history of conflict with several Conclave member species that had resulted in them being classified under Conclave taxonomy as managed aggressors. This meant that the Conclave actively and deliberately kept them from expanding, from trading freely, and from developing certain technologies on the grounds that an unconstrained Drevithi civilization would be a threat to regional stability. What it actually meant was that a proud, capable, enormously talented people had been held in place for 140 years by a system designed to ensure they never became powerful enough to threaten the people managing them. I understood that feeling. We made contact through a Drevithi scout vessel that caught one of our survey ships in a scan at the edge of their system. The Drevithi captain hailed us on a standard frequency, and his first question was direct. "What are you? And why do you not appear in any conclave registry?" Our communications officer, a sharp man named Callum Foster, answered without hesitation, "We're humans. We were removed from the registry 11 years ago." There was a pause. Then the Drevithi captain said, with what the translator rendered as careful neutrality, "Removed. Expelled," Callum said, because he was the kind of man who believed in precision. "They called us an uncontrolled variable and quarantined our system. We left." Another pause. Longer this time. "Then how?" Callum grinned, and I could hear it in his voice even through the channel. "We built our own ships." The relationship with the Drevithi did not begin warmly. They were cautious, as any species with their history had reason to be, and there were formal meetings and careful conversations in a period of about 3 months where I was fairly certain they were running extensive background checks on everything we said. But the thing that changed it was not diplomacy. It was a conclave military vessel. In year 14, a conclave enforcement patrol, the kind the conclave sent to remind member and protected species of their obligations, entered the Drevithi system and positioned itself between their home world and a supply convoy they were bringing in from one of their own outlying stations. The patrol did not fire. It did not need to. Simply being there, with weapons visible and transponder broadcasting the conclave's authority frequency, was enough. The convoy stopped. The Drevithi government filed a protest that would take years to be reviewed. One of our survey ships happened to be in the system. Derek Hale happened to be commanding it, because Derek had a gift for being exactly where things were becoming interesting. He did not ask for permission. He moved the ship between the Conclave Patrol and the Drevithi convoy, parked it there with running lights on and systems powered down to non-threatening levels, and then he opened a channel to the patrol and said, pleasantly, "We seem to be in the same area." Lovely day for it. The patrol commander demanded to know what registry we belonged to. Derek told him we were the sovereignty of unregistered worlds, which was a name we had been casually using internally for about 8 months, and which had not, until that moment, been announced to anyone outside our own people. The commander said he had no record of such an entity. Derek said, with complete sincerity, "We're aware. You're welcome to contact the Conclave Secretariat. We'll be here." The patrol held its position for 4 hours, made several transmissions that we assumed were queries to their command structure, and then left. Derek Hale then called me, which he was not supposed to do on an open channel, and said, "I named us. Hope that's all right." I was quiet for a moment, running the name through my head. The sovereignty of unregistered worlds. It was a bit dramatic. It was also in the specific way of names that stick exactly right. "It's all right," I said. The Drevithi fleet commander, a woman named Velsurta who had led her people's military for 20 years and was not easily impressed by anything, sent us a formal message 48 hours later. It said, in its entirety, "You parked a ship between us and a conclave patrol. We would like to know why." I drafted the response myself. It said, "Because you could have used the company." The Drevithi did not answer for a week. Then they invited us for formal talks. Those talks lasted 9 months and produced the first non-human members of the sovereignty of unregistered worlds. The Drevithi did not join us quietly or tentatively. They joined us fully, bringing their fleet, their technology, their resources, and a kind of fierce, focused energy that made our own engineers extremely excited and our diplomatic staff worked twice as hard. Sandra Okafor and a Drevithi propulsion specialist named Koth spent 6 weeks in an argument that Priya Ashford later described as the most productive disagreement in the history of faster-than-light engineering. They emerged with a drive modification that increased our range by 30% and reduced fuel consumption by almost half. We were not 11 humans in a rattling ship anymore. By year 16, the sovereignty had 7 member species, 43 settled worlds, and a combined fleet that the Conclave's intelligence apparatus, we later learned, had massively underestimated because no one inside the Conclave's analytical divisions had seriously believed we could build what we built in the time we built it. The assumption had been that without Conclave support, without Conclave technology, without Conclave trade, humanity would spend the first decade struggling to maintain its own solar system and the second decade beginning to ask for readmission. Nobody had told that to Caroline Webb, or Gregory Cole, or Derek Hale, or Sandra Okafor, or Fiona Park, who had looked at a rock on a cold world and called it good, or Leon Price, who had followed a signal nobody expected him to find, or Callum Foster, who answered a Drevethy captain with complete honesty about who we were and why we didn't appear in anyone's registry, or Priya Ashford, who had learned an alien language in 2 weeks because she was paying very close attention, or any of the 400,000 other people who had looked at a sealed door and started looking for windows. The Conclave sent its first official communique to the sovereignty of unregistered worlds in year 17. It was a legal notice, formally worded, invoking Conclave Accord 7, which prohibited the formation of unauthorized political entities in unregistered space. It demanded we cease operations and submit to registry review. I read it very carefully. Then I set it aside and went back to the briefing for our 18th settlement mission, which was launching in the morning. We did not respond. According to the records kept by the Conclave Secretariat, this was the first time any entity had received an Accord 7 notice and not replied. The Secretariat staff member who logged it apparently added a personal note that read, "No response." Unprecedented. I take a small amount of satisfaction in that. Year 20 brought us something I had not anticipated. Conclave species requesting private meetings. Not the Conclave as an institution. Individual member species reaching out through careful, quiet channels, asking questions that amounted to what exactly is the sovereignty, and is it too late to ask about it? Some were small species who had always been at the margins of Conclave influence, doing as they were told because they lacked the power to do otherwise. Some were larger species who had grown quietly uncomfortable with certain Conclave policies over the decades and had never had anywhere else to look. A few were species who had simply watched what we built and were running the numbers and concluding, with the practical intelligence of civilizations that had survived for centuries, that the future looked different than it had 10 years ago. I met with all of them. I was patient. I was honest about what the sovereignty was and what it was not. I was clear about what membership meant and what it did not require. I said the same thing to each of them that the Asheni had said to us in our first conversations, because it seemed right. We are interested in neighbors, not subjects. By year 22, the sovereignty had 14 member species. By year 25, 21. Each edition brought new technology, new knowledge, new people who expanded what the sovereignty could do and be. The Asheni, who had reached early spaceflight capability with our support, contributed a biological research tradition that transformed our medical programs. The Drevethy engineering combined with our own produced ship designs that were genuinely new, not derived from Conclave templates or human improvisation, but something built from scratch by minds that had never been told it couldn't be done. There were hard years inside those good ones. I will not pretend otherwise. A settlement on a world we called Harrow failed in year 18 when a geological survey missed a fault system under the Central Colony Zone, and we lost buildings, infrastructure, and 4 people before we could evacuate the rest. A dispute between 2 sovereignty member species over resource rights in year 20 required 8 months of direct mediation and produced the sovereignty's first legal framework for interspecies arbitration, which was a valuable document that I would have much preferred to develop under less stressful circumstances. A Conclave enforcement action in year 23 pushed a non-member species that had been trading with us to sever those trade connections under threat of losing their own Conclave protections, and I spent a full month angry about that in a way that I tried to keep out of my work and mostly failed. But the trajectory was clear. Every year, the sovereignty grew. Every year, the Conclave's control over the regions beyond its registered boundaries became less absolute. Every year, the map of what was unregistered got smaller because we were registering things in our own records under our own system with our own member species as witnesses. In year 26, we had 312 ships. In year 26, we had 43 settled worlds with combined population exceeding 12 million. In year 26, I held a meeting in the Sovereignty's Central Administrative Station, a place called Anchor because that is what I needed it to feel like, with the leaders of 21 species and 600 years of combined interstellar experience, and I put a document on the table and said we had a decision to make. The document was a formal application for conclave recognition, not because we needed it. Let me be absolutely clear about that. We did not need it. The sovereignty existed. It functioned. Its worlds were fed and safe and growing. Its ships moved through space that the conclave had tried to define as territory and was rapidly discovering was not as manageable as it had been when no one was testing the edges. We needed the recognition because the conclave's legal framework still defined the rules by which interstellar trade and navigation operated across most of the galaxy, and operating permanently outside that framework meant every sovereignty ship in conclave-adjacent space was technically in violation of laws written by a body that had never once asked our input. We could ignore those laws. We had been ignoring them for years. But there were sovereignty member species who traded with conclave worlds, whose populations had family and history on the conclave side of the boundary. And for them, the legal ambiguity was not an abstraction. It was a daily complication. And there was another reason, which I said plainly to the room. We went out there because we had no choice, I said. We built this because we had to. But the galaxy is large, and the conclave has been the only structure governing it for 400 years, and we can either spend the next 400 years fighting them from the outside, or we can walk back in and change things from the inside. Vel Surta of the Drevathi, who had been present at most of the important moments in the sovereignty's history, and whose opinion I respected more than almost anyone's, looked at me for a long moment, and then said, "You want to sit down at their table?" "I want to put our own table next to theirs," I said. And I wanted to be bigger. There was silence in the room. And then, one by one, the leaders of 21 species began to nod. The application was filed in year 27. It was delivered not by a diplomatic message or a transmission, but by a fleet of 312 ships that entered the outer edge of conclave space and decelerated to a polite, visible, impossible to ignore stop. Every long-range sensor in the quadrant would have shown them. A fleet of ships from a dozen species, flying in loose formation, flying under a flag that had been designed in a cold docking bay on an unregistered moon by people from 9 different worlds who had argued pleasantly about the colors for 3 days before agreeing on something that used no single species' traditional symbols because it belonged to all of them. A single shuttle broke from the fleet. 2 people aboard, me and a pilot. We flew the same route I had flown 27 years before, alone, in a borrowed embassy shuttle, toward a hall where 47 species had decided what to do with humanity. I read the same 412 articles of Conclave, Accord 14, on the way. I had read them many times since the first night I studied them in the embassy shuttle going home. The words had not changed. My understanding of them had changed completely. When we arrived at the Velcaris diplomatic station, the conclave had already scrambled 17 different representative bodies into emergency session. News of the fleet had traveled fast. I was given a landing pad and a security escort, and the kind of careful, watchful courtesy extended to someone who has arrived with 300 ships and asked to speak. The Hall of Accord was the same. The ceiling still vanished into atmospheric haze. The speaking floor was the same polished surface where I had stood 27 years before with my translator bead active and my case prepared and my complete confidence that reason would prevail. I had been wrong about that last part then. I was not going to make the same mistake. The new arbiter was a Velcari named Len. She was younger than Soreth had been and had the look of someone who had been managing the political implications of the sovereignty's existence for several years and was not entirely glad to see me walk onto the speaking floor. I understood. I was not here to make her job easier. I was here to make something else happen. I placed the Sovereignty Charter on the dais. It was a physical document printed on material manufactured on New Meridian, signed by 21 species leaders in 21 different scripts. I set it there and I stepped back and I said, without preamble, "We would like to register." The hall erupted. I stood completely still while the noise washed over me. Representatives leaning toward each other, Translation rods active, the particular kind of organized chaos that happens when a room full of very old institutions is confronted with something it did not plan for. I heard fragments through my translator bead. Legal arguments, procedural objections, the word unprecedented used 7 times in the first 30 seconds. Arbiter Lin raised a hand, and the noise settled into a watchful silence. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the charter on the dais. Then she looked at me again. Ambassador Voss, she said, and the title was an interesting choice because I held no official title from any recognized body, and using it was either a diplomatic habit or an acknowledgement that the world had shifted. Arbiter Lin, I said, the conclave will require time to review this application. Of course, I said. We will be outside. I picked up a copy of the charter and left it on the dais. The original was already in our records. Then I turned and walked back across the speaking floor, and the great doors of the Hall of Accord opened ahead of me, and I walked through them. My pilot, a young woman named Cora Webb, yes, Caroline's daughter, and she had her mother's comm, was waiting in the corridor. She fell in a step beside me, without a word. We walked back to the shuttle in silence, and only when we were in the air, climbing away from the Valkyrie's surface, did she speak. How did it go? I looked down at the planet below, at the ancient city that held the most powerful legal body in the galaxy, now an emergency session because of a document placed on a dais by one woman who had been thrown out of the same room 27 years ago. Well, I said, I think it went well. The review lasted 3 days. I attended every session. I was not required to. The Sovereignty's Charter was before the conclave for assessment, not debate, and technically I had no standing to be present as anything other than an observer. But the Arbiter had granted observer status to the Sovereignty delegation, and I sat in the upper gallery every day and listened to 400 years of galactic law being examined and re-examined in light of a situation it had never anticipated. The arguments against recognition were thorough and, in some cases, genuinely well-reasoned. A representative from Avorith, one of the older conclave species, deeply invested in the existing order, made an elegant case that the sovereignty's formation violated the spirit of 17 separate accords, even if it could not be proven to violate the letter of any specific one. He argued that allowing the sovereignty to register would set a precedent that would destabilize every protected world arrangement and managed development agreement the conclave maintained. He was correct that it would set a precedent. He delivered this argument with the calm certainty of a person who has never had to question which side of the arrangement they were on. A representative from the Shan, a small species I had not known well before the banishment, made an argument that landed differently. She said that the sovereignty's existence had already done what the Vorith representative feared. It had changed what was possible. 3 protected species had already opened informal trade with sovereignty member worlds. 2 more were in quiet discussions with sovereignty diplomatic staff. The conditions the Vorith representative was trying to prevent had already arrived. The question was not whether to recognize the sovereignty, but whether the conclave would choose to exist in relationship with it or in permanent antagonism. On the second day, the Hesh representative, a different individual than the one who had looked at me with regret 27 years before, but from the same species, made an argument that I suspect no one expected. He walked to the center floor, and he said that he had been reviewing the original banishment proceedings, and that upon review, the charges of unauthorized intervention that had resulted in Earth's excision from the registry described actions that had, by every measurable outcome, produced good results for the beings involved. He said that Accord 14, under which the banishment had been issued, contained no clause addressing the scenario where the interference had objectively helped. He said this appeared to be an oversight. The room was very quiet when he finished. Arbiter Lin did not look in my direction. She had, I noticed, been careful not to look in my direction very often. I respected the discipline it required. On the 3rd day, I was invited to make a statement to the full conclave. Not to argue the charter's merits. That was for the council to assess. Just to speak. I had been preparing that statement for 27 years without knowing it. I stood on the speaking floor where I had once been silenced mid-sentence, and I looked up at the gallery, and I said what I had come to say. I said that I did not blame them for the banishment. I meant that. We had been unpredictable. We had broken rules they considered important. We had acted on values that did not align with their system's priorities, and we had not been willing to stop doing so. If I were managing a vast interstellar order and a new species arrived who helped people without asking permission first, I might also have found that uncomfortable. I said that the 27 years since the banishment had been the hardest in human history and the most important. We had lost people. We had lost settlements. We had experienced failures that I still thought about in the quiet hours. We had also built something that I believed demonstrated that humanity's values, the values that had made us an uncontrolled variable, were not a bug in our design. They were the design. We helped people because we could not help it. Apparently, given sufficient time and necessity, we helped other species do the same thing. I said that the sovereignty of unregistered worlds was not asking the conclave to change its rules. We were asking to be part of the conversation about what the rules should be. There was a difference. I said that we were not coming back to prove anything to anyone. We were coming back because the galaxy was large and the problems in it were real, and there was more than enough work for everyone who was willing to do it. I paused. The room was very still. Then I said, "We were told 27 years ago that we did not belong here. I'm standing on this floor again. You could draw your own conclusions." I stepped back. Lynn called the vote on the third morning. The application for recognition required a simple majority of the 47-member species. Voices were cast aloud, as conclave tradition required, each representative stating their position for the record. I sat in the gallery and listened. I had not told anyone my prediction. I had not made one. Predictions had not been useful to me in this room before. The first 12 votes were split, 13 to 17. The Hesh voted for. The Vorith voted against. The smaller species who had been quietly watching the sovereignty for years began to come down, one by one, in favor. A large military species called the Kether, who I had expected to oppose recognition on strategic grounds, surprised me by voting in favor with a short statement that their analysis indicated the sovereignty's defensive capabilities were sufficient that antagonism was impractical. I appreciated the honesty. The final tally was 31 in favor, 16 against. Arbiter Lynn looked down at the speaking floor. Then she looked up at the gallery where I was sitting. She said, in the flat, formal tone of official conclave proceedings, "The application for recognition is approved. The sovereignty of unregistered worlds is hereby entered into the Galactic Registry as a recognized interstellar political entity. All associated legal rights and responsibilities are effective immediately." She paused. Then she said, without formality, just one Velcari woman looking at one human woman across the distance, "Welcome back, Ambassador Voss." I did not cry. I had cried, privately and alone, in year 3 of the banishment, and in year 14 during those funerals I never spoke about, and once in year 21, when a transmission came in from New Meridian showing a school full of children born on a world that had not existed before we built it. I had done my crying at appropriate times. What I felt in that moment was something harder to name. Not triumph. Not relief, exactly. Something more like the particular sensation of completing a very long sentence that you started a very long time ago, and were not always sure you would be allowed to finish. I stood up. Isemt aerbitorlen. I walked out of the gallery and down through the corridors of the Hall of Accord, past the security drones and the waiting diplomatic staff and the representatives of species who watched me pass with expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation to something that might, on a good day, be called respect. I walked out into the open air of Velcaris Prime. The sky was the same pale gold it had been 27 years ago. The ancient city stretched around the hall in every direction, old beyond any human frame of reference. Cora Webb was leaning against the side of our shuttle with her arms crossed and her face arranged in the patient expression of someone who has been told not to ask questions until she gets a signal. I gave her the signal. I smiled. She straightened up immediately. "Well, I thought about 31 votes out of 47. I thought about 312 ships in formation on the edge of conclave space. I thought about Derek Hale climbing out of a vibrating FTL prototype with the grin of a man who had just gotten away with something. I thought about Caroline Webb rebuilding an alien reactor core in a workshop that smelled like solder and coffee. I I thought about a Drevethy and a human engineer spending 6 weeks arguing productively and changing the nature of faster-than-light travel. I thought about Owen Birch, who had been right about the coupling system, and about the 4 people on Harrow who did not make it out before the buildings came down, and about the settlements that went dark in year 3 and did not come back. I thought about Arbiter Sorith watching me leave 27 years ago with something like pity on his face. I hoped, wherever the Valkyrie went after they died, he had been told how it turned out. I looked up at the quarantine buoys. They had been deactivated 3 weeks ago, quietly, by our own technical teams. We had not announced it. We had simply done it, the way we did most things, because it needed doing, and we were there and we could. 31-16, I said. Cora's face broke into the kind of smile that her mother used to have in workshops at 2 in the morning when something finally worked. That's a majority. That is a majority, I agreed. She pulled open the shuttle door. Ready to go home? I looked one more time at the Hall of Accord behind us, at the flag of the sovereignty we had placed on every diplomatic surface in the building as procedural right, at the planet of Velcaris Prime stretched out under a pale gold sky, ancient and vast, and no longer the only place where the rules were made. Then I got in the shuttle. Yes, I said. Take us home. Cora took us home. The flight back through conclave space was quiet. Ships moved out of our path not because we asked them to, but because 300 vessels in formation have a certain conversational quality about them, and the conversation they were conducting was being heard clearly. We passed the old quarantine boundary without ceremony. The buoys were dark. No red lights. Just open space and stars, and the particular feeling of moving through something that used to be a wall. I sat in the co-pilot's seat and watched the stars shift as we accelerated, and I thought about what came next, because there was always something that came next. The sovereignty had been recognized. That meant legal standing, trade rights, navigation protections, and a seat at the table where galactic policy was made. It also meant obligations, oversight, and the permanent, complicated work of being in relationship with 47 species who had, for the most part, not been expecting us to come back at all. 16 of them had voted against us. I was not going to forget that, but I was also not going to make it the center of things. They had reasons. Some of those reasons were self-interested and small. Some were genuinely about stability and precedent and the real complexity of managing a structure that had kept the peace, imperfectly but consistently, for 4 centuries. The work of the next years would not be celebration. It would be the slow, patient, and frequently frustrating process of operating inside a system we had helped to change. We were good at frustrating processes. We had practice. I opened a channel to the fleet behind us and spoke briefly to Derek Hale, who was commanding the formation and who sounded, characteristically, like someone who was enjoying himself thoroughly. 31-16, I told him. There was a pause on the channel, and then, could have been better, could have been worse. True. Another pause. The Kether surprised me. Me too. Practical people, Derek said, with what sounded like approval. Get some sleep, I said. We have a lot of work in the morning. We always have a lot of work in the morning. That's because we keep making more, I said, and closed the channel. Cora glanced at me from the pilot's seat. What happens now? It was the right question. It was in some ways the only question, and I'd been thinking about it for 3 days in that gallery, watching 400 years of galactic law catch up with what 27 years of stubbornness had built. What happened now was this. The sovereignty would send its first permanent representative to the conclave's assembly. We had been discussing candidates, and the leading choice was Priya Ashford, whose gift for language and attention had built our first interstellar friendship, and who would, I suspected, be the best diplomat in that hall within 2 years of arrival. The Drevethy would push for reform of the managed development policies that had held them in place, and they would push hard, and some of those reforms would pass, and some would not, and the ones that didn't would be pushed for again. The Ashini would continue their development, and we would be there for it, as neighbors, as the kind of neighbors who showed up when things got hard without being asked and who did not apologize for it. The 16 species who voted against us would watch. Some of them would change their minds when they saw how things went. Some would not. That was the nature of a system large enough to contain 47 different histories and 47 different ways of understanding what safety and order and fairness meant. We would be part of that system now. Imperfect, complicated, frequently argued about participants in a conversation we had been excluded from for 27 years. The stars moved past the viewport, familiar and enormous. I thought about a cold moon and a flag designed by 9 species who couldn't agree on the colors. I thought about an ugly ship that vibrated like an annoyed bee and a young pilot who climbed out of it grinning. I thought about a woman who rebuilt an alien reactor because it needed to work and there was no one else to do it. I thought about a man who mapped transit routes from memory because the charts had been taken away and the routes still needed to be there. I thought about the kind of species we were, the kind that found extinction annoying, the kind that helped people without being asked, the kind that looked at a sealed door and went looking for windows and, when they couldn't find windows, built their own doors. We were not perfect. We had made mistakes I would carry for the rest of my life. We were going to make more. The history of the next century would include things that no one in that fleet could predict or prepare for. And some of those things would be hard in ways that I could not yet imagine. But we would be there for them. We would show up. We would do the work. That was, in the end, what we were. Cora brought us through the last transit point, and ahead of us the lights of the Sovereignty's anchor station bloomed against the dark. The hub of something that had been built from nothing by people who did not stop when they were told to stop, and around it the ships of 14. No, now officially recognized. Member species moved in their ordinary patterns. The quiet business of a civilization that had been doing its work for 27 years and had every intention of continuing. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at Cora and said, "Home." She smiled. Her mother smile, the one for two in the morning when something finally works. "Home," she agreed and brought us in.